You know, usually when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of absolute precision.
Right, like it's a science.
Exactly. It feels like engineering. You
Right.
break your arm, you go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen, and the doctor just points at it and says, there it is.
Yeah, broken or not broken. Very binary.
Right. It's clean, it's objective, and everyone in the room completely agrees on what they're looking at. But arguments over the Constitution don't work like x-rays.
No, they certainly do not.
Whether we're talking about a massive society-altering decision at the Supreme Court or just, a heated argument around your dinner table over who has the right to do what, people rarely agree on the diagnosis.
That is so true.
Instead of looking at the same x-ray, it honestly often feels like people are speaking completely different languages. I mean, they aren't just disagreeing on the rules of the game, they're disagreeing on reality itself.
Yeah, it is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. When people argue about justice or rights or, what a specific law fundamentally means, they're usually arguing from entirely different philosophical foundations without even realizing it.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. They're literally standing on different tectonic plates.
And to understand why those plates are constantly shifting beneath our feet, we are going to take a deep dive into an incredible scholarly book by Stephen M. Feldman. It's called American Legal Thought, From Premodernism to Postmodernism, an Intellectual Voyage.
It's a fantastic source.
Yeah.
Really comprehensive.
So our mission today, for you listening, is to shortcut your way to being profoundly well-informed about the very DNA of American legal thought. We're going to trace a 200-plus year intellectual journey through the elite thinkers, the scholars, the judges of American jurisprudence.
The ones really shaping the system.
Exactly. We're going to look at how they completely rebooted their definition of truth, reality, and the law 3 separate times.
Yeah, it's a massive shift each time.
But before we get into the American founders, Feldman gives us a specific framework to organize all this history, right? He uses something called a Weberian ideal type. And okay, let's unpack this because that sounds like incredibly dense sociology jargon.
I know. It does sound dense. But the concept is actually incredibly intuitive. The term comes from the sociologist Max Weber. Think of an ideal type not as something that is practically perfect, but as a conceptual pure form.
Okay.
It is essentially a theoretical measuring stick.
Right, like the concepts of an introvert or an extrovert in psychology.
Yes, exactly that.
Because nobody is 100% an extrovert, right? Partying 24 hours a day without ever needing a moment of quiet. But having that ideal type category helps us analyze and organize, incredibly complex human behavior.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
So Feldman organizes history into 3 massive intellectual paradigms using this method. We have premodernism, modernism, and postmodernism.
The big 3.
Right. Now, the crucial thing to remember here is that these aren't rigidly fated historical necessities.
What do you mean by that?
Well, it's not like society was magically destined to flip a switch and move from premodernism to modernism on a specific Tuesday in 1789.
Right, like suddenly everyone woke up and changed their minds.
Exactly. There are always overlapping ideas. But these 3 categories act as powerful interpretive lenses. They help us spot historical patterns, track shifting cultural anxieties, and really understand how people in different eras fundamentally viewed the architecture of the world.
Okay, so to understand the American legal system, we actually need to chart these broader intellectual waters first. We have to understand the philosophical gravity of these 3 eras globally.
We do. We have to look at the water they were swimming in.
Let's start with premodernism then. If I am a pre-modern thinker, what is my baseline assumption about the universe?
Your absolute baseline is an abiding faith in a stable, foundational source of knowledge and value.
Meaning there's a bedrock somewhere?
Exactly. And that source is usually nature or God or a pantheon of gods.
Yeah.
Universals exist. Truth is objective. And most importantly, it's already out there. You do not invent the truth.
You discover it.
You discover it. And Feldman divides this pre-modern era into 2 distinct substages. The first is the cyclical stage, which is heavily rooted in the ancient Greeks and Plato.
Okay, so where Plato talks about the ideas or the forms, like the idea that there's a perfect universal chair or universal justice just floating in the ether and everything on earth is just a shadow of it.
Yes, exactly. The Greeks developed this concept of the cosmos, an ordered totality of being. They didn't really see a separation between physics, morality, and law.
So it's all one big package.
Right. The physical world, ethical virtues, societal customs, and legal rules were all woven together in one rational, divine fabric. Truth and virtue were immanent, meaning they were readily accessible to human reason if you simply paid attention.
So it wasn't hidden away.
No, as Plato would argue, learning the truth wasn't about empirical discovery. It was about recollection. Your soul already knew the universal truths, and the physical world just helped you remember them.
Wow, okay. But how do they view the progression of time? I mean, if everything is just a reflection of eternal truths, does society even move forward?
Well, to understand their view of time, you have to think about nature. Sunrise, sunset, summer, winter, birth, maturity, decay.
Cycles.
Exactly. The Greeks looked at the physical world and applied that exact same biological logic to human societies, governments, and empires. Civilizations are born, they reach a peak of maturity, and then, inevitably, they become corrupt, they decay, and they fall.
It's a biological cycle. History just repeats itself over and over.
Right, there is no concept of endless human progress in this stage.
Okay, so if that cyclical Greek model is a wheel, constantly spinning round and round from birth to decay, what breaks the wheel? You mentioned a second substage of premodernism.
The wheel gets broken by the eschatological stage, which is heavily influenced by early Christianity, specifically thinkers like St. Augustine in the 5th century.
Okay, Augustine.
Yeah, he writes The City of God, and he introduces a profound philosophical shift. We still have universal truths ordained by a creator, but now there is a sharp separation between the spiritual and the carnal.
Like the heavenly city and the earthly city.
Precisely. And most importantly, Augustine introduces a divine end goal. So history is no longer a wheel.
It becomes a straight line, like pointing at a specific target.
Exactly. Teleology enters the picture. Progress is suddenly possible, but it is so vital to understand that it is not endless secular human progress. It is a movement toward the realization of God's ultimate principles.
So it has a finish line.
Yes, it is sacred history moving toward an eschatological or end times fulfillment. Every event, every war, every law is pulling humanity closer to a divine finish line.
Okay, that sets up the pre-modern mindset perfectly. We have a unified world of universal truths, moving either in inescapable natural cycles or marching steadily toward a divine endpoint. The truth is anchored.
Very deeply anchored.
But then, the world fractures, we enter the modern era, and everything gets incredibly anxious. How does that foundation crack?
Well, the bridge to modernism is actually built on theology, which is a fascinating paradox.
Wait, really? Yeah. Because we always think of modernism as this purely secular scientific movement.
Right, we usually do, but it actually starts with the Protestant Reformation in the 16th century. Martin Luther, and particularly John Calvin, create a radical theological dualism.
What do they do?
They strictly and severely separate the spiritual realm from the secular realm. Calvin argued that the secular world is purely material, thoroughly fallen, and totally corrupt.
Okay, so if the secular world is totally corrupt, then God isn't actively organizing the daily affairs of the marketplace or the government anymore.
That is the pivotal realization. For Calvin, spiritual salvation has absolutely nothing to do with what you achieve in the earthly secular world. The two realms are divorced, and this births the central driving anxiety of modernism.
Because if the secular world is just empty, material stuff, devoid of inherent divine purpose, humans suddenly look around and realize they are alone in the driver's seat.
Exactly. They realize they're in charge.
They realize, hey, we can impose our own purpose on this. We can measure it, we can manipulate it, we can control it. And I'm guessing this perfectly coincides with the scientific revolution, right?
Spot on. You've got Galileo looking through the telescope, Newton calculating gravity, Francis Bacon developing the scientific method. They are seeing incredible, limitless technological progress.
But philosophically, they must be terrified. I mean, they just lost their safety net.
Terrified is the right word. They have thrown away the old religious foundations for secular knowledge. They can no longer say, well, the law is this way because God ordained it in the cosmos.
So what do they do?
So they go on a desperate, centuries-long quest for new foundations to justify human knowledge and societal structure.
Which brings us to René Descartes, sitting in his room, doubting everything until he hits, I think, therefore I am.
Yes, Descartes is the prototype for the first major stage of modernism rationalism. He looks at the crumbling pre-modern world and decides to apply a method of extreme radical doubt to everything.
So he just strips it all down.
He strips away tradition, religious dogma, and even the reliability of his own senses. until he hits what he believes is the absolute bedrock of reality, the reasoning, thinking self.
And this creates what philosophers call metaphysical dualism, right? A
Yeah,
sharp, agonizing separation between the subjective, independent human mind and the objective, external, physical world.
that's it exactly.
So instead of truth being a divine, interconnected web that we're all just a small part of, truth becomes something the human brain actively extracts from a cold, dead, material universe using pure math and logic. The mind is basically the conqueror of matter.
It is. But Descartes' fortress of logic was quickly besieged by later modernists. Thinkers started asking a very dangerous question. If the self is totally separate from the physical world, how can abstract, internal reason ever truly know the external world?
Oh, that's a good point. Like, how do I know my logic actually matches reality?
Right. And this leads to the second stage of modernism empiricism. Thinkers like John Locke and David Hume argue that truth doesn't come from abstract internal math. It comes from sensory experience of the physical world.
You have to actually observe, measure, and compile data.
Yes.
And this empirical turn ties directly into the birth of capitalism and modern democracy, doesn't it?
It is the absolute bedrock of it. Modernist individualism reaches its peak right here. John Locke justifies the concept of private property not by divine right, but based on individual human labor. You mix your labor with the earth and you own the result.
And then Adam Smith comes along with the concept of the invisible hand in the marketplace.
Exactly. The idea that if every autonomous, rational individual uses their empirical knowledge to pursue their own self-interest in the secular marketplace, society will endlessly progress.
So notice the massive shift in the concept of time here. Progress is no longer about reaching a predetermined divine endpoint, like Augustine believed. Progress in the modern era is limitless.
Yes, it's a line that goes up and to the right forever, driven entirely by human ingenuity, science, and control.
You know, I'm seeing a deep contradiction in modernism. On one hand, it's this incredibly arrogant era. We can conquer nature, we can split the atom, we can build endless wealth.
Very arrogant.
But on the other hand, it is deeply anxious because we are constantly terrified that the floor is going to drop out from under our logic and our empirical data. We are desperately trying to prove that our man-made systems are objectively true.
And that is exactly the illusion that shatters when we hit the postmodern era. The foundation finally crumbles.
So what happens?
Well, if modernism is defined by the desperate, frantic search for an objective foundation, whether through logic, science, or procedure, postmodernism is the realization that the search itself is futile. There is no bedrock.
It's just turtles all the way down.
Pretty much. Thinkers in the mid to late 20th century, like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault, usher in concepts like anti-foundationalism and anti-essentialism.
Let's define those because they sound intimidating. Anti-foundationalism just means there is no ultimate objective ground for truth, right? No God, no pure logic, no perfectly neutral perspective.
Correct. And anti-essentialism means things don't have a pure inherent essence. A chair isn't a chair because it perfectly reflects the Platonic form of chairness floating out in the universe somewhere.
Right.
It's a chair because our specific culture and language mutually agree to use that word for that object. Meaning is never stable. Truth is always contingent.
It's shaped by context.
Highly shaped by culture, language, tradition, and most importantly, power. There is no purely objective vantage point from which to view the world. We are all wearing tinted glasses, and we can never take them off.
But if I fully embrace that, if I accept there's no objective truth and everything is just a cultural construct, doesn't that lead to total nihilism? I mean, how do postmodernists function in the real world if they believe everything is built on sand?
The mechanism they use to survive is irony, coupled with hermeneutics, which is the study of interpretation. Rather than falling into despair, postmodernists just accept that all truths are culturally constructed. They accept that power dynamics are everywhere.
So they just lean into it.
They do.
Yeah.
They know they can't establish an absolute universal truth,
Mm.
but they still have to operate in the world, right?
Yeah.
So they play with the pieces of modernism. They use irony to show that they know the game is rigged.
Oh, I see.
They write academic papers, they argue in court, but they do it with a wink, acknowledging that their definition of justice is just one interpretive framework competing against all the others.
Okay, so we have our map now. Premodernism relies on universal divine truth and fears decay. Modernism relies on human reason and science, desperately trying to control the world and achieve endless progress. And postmodernism exposes that all those foundations are culturally constructed illusions driven by power.
That's the framework, exactly.
So now that we understand the philosophical water, let's look at the swimmers. Let's see how the American founders actually applied this to the law, starting in 1776.
Okay, so when you look at the founding of the United States, you're looking at first stage pre-modern American law.
Pre-modern.
Yes, read the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson is explicitly appealing to the laws of nature and of nature's God. American law starts with a deep, unshakable faith in natural law. They are borrowing heavily from the great English jurist William Blackstone, who essentially wrote the textbook on the common law.
And Blackstone believed there were universal moral principles woven into the very fabric of the universe by a creator, right?
He did. And he believed these principles were perfectly discoverable by human reason and revelation. A judge wasn't inventing a law. A judge was discovering the divine law that already governed the situation.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. But here's the critical part, and it often surprises people today. We tend to look back at the founders and think of them as these ultimate, forward-thinking, modern progressives, inventing a brand new democratic future. But according to Feldman's framework, they were deeply, fundamentally pre-modern.
You're saying they held that Machiavellian cyclical view of history, the Greek wheel of birth, maturity, and decay.
They were utterly terrified of the biological life cycle of empires. I mean, they look across the Atlantic at Europe, and what did they see? They saw decay. They saw corruption. They saw luxury destroying virtue. They believed human nature was inherently selfish and that republics were incredibly fragile constructs.
So when they sat down to write the Constitution, they weren't trying to progress in a modernist sense. They weren't trying to endlessly reorder society for maximum economic utility or technological advancement.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Their goal was preservation. They wrote the Constitution to preserve a fragile republic against the inevitable, creeping decay that history proved destroys all civilizations.
That is a staggering irony. The founders instituted a radical, violent revolution against the British Empire, specifically to prevent change.
Yes.
They wanted to lock in what they saw as pristine, natural, pre-modern virtues before the decay could set in. They were literally revolutionaries fighting for stasis.
It's fascinating, isn't it? And their view of the courtroom reflected this defensive posture. Early American jurists, people like Nathaniel Chipman in Vermont or Zephaniah Swift in Connecticut, they viewed the common law as a science. But they did not mean science in the modern, experimental, let's see what happens sense.
What do they mean?
They used Francis Bacon's method of scientific classification. They believed natural law principles existed perfectly out there in the universe, almost exactly like those Platonic forms we discussed.
Let's make this concrete for a second. Say I am a farmer in 1790, and my neighbor steals my cow. We go to court. How is the judge viewing this dispute through a pre-modern lens?
Well, the judge does not look at your stolen cow and think, well, how can I resolve this to maximize the agricultural output of the county? Or what is the best public policy going forward?
They don't care about the economy?
No. The judge believes there is an eternal, universal principle of property rights and justice that already exists. Your specific court case, the messy reality of the stolen cow, the angry neighbor, the mud on the boots, is just an imperfect, sensible reflection of that universal truth.
So the judge is basically acting like an astronomer trying to chart the movement of the stars. The stars don't care about the astronomer. They just follow the divine math. The judge's job is simply to discover the eternal principle that governs the cow and apply it.
Exactly. The principles of justice are universal and unchanging. The individual cases are just the earthly manifestations of those principles. The goal of the judge is discovery, not creation.
But America didn't stay locked in that defensive, cyclical mindset for long, right? We move into the 1820s. The founding generation starts dying off. And side note, the fact that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams both died on the exact 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence is still one of the wildest coincidences in human history.
It really is unbelievable.
But so, a new generation of lawyers and politicians takes over.
And this marks the shift to second stage pre-modern law. The Republic survived its infancy. The British didn't conquer them in the War of 1812. The country is expanding rapidly westward, technology is improving, canals are being dug, railroads are starting to be laid down.
Things are moving fast.
Really fast. The cyclical fear of inevitable decay gives way to the eschatological idea of progress.
Ah, the Augustan straight line pointing toward the divine target.
Exactly. Jurists of this era, like Chancellor James Kent in New York and Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, Start using the law very pragmatically to promote commerce and economic energy.
Give me an example of how they changed the law to do that.
A classic example is the radical shift in property law. Under the first stage of premodernism, property law was entirely about protecting your land from interference, keeping it secure and stable so no one could harm it.
Right, preserving it.
Yes, if you earned a farm, your neighbor couldn't do anything that materially altered your land. But in the 1820s and 30s, the courts started changing the rules to allow commercial development.
How so?
Suddenly, if you built a massive, economically productive textile mill on your property and damming the river slightly flooded your neighbor's farm, the courts might actually protect you, the mill owner.
Why? Because the mill is producing goods, employing people, and promoting economic progress for the whole community, whereas the neighbor is just sitting on a static farm.
That is exactly the reasoning. The courts prioritize dynamic economic growth over static property protection.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there. If Kent and Story are actively altering the rules of property to promote the economy, aren't they basically acting like modernists?
It does seem that way.
I mean, aren't they looking at society, deciding they want more wealth, and socially engineering the law to get it? That sounds like pure secular progress.
And it absolutely looks like it on the surface, and that is a brilliant observation. But you're listening to this and thinking, Kent and Story just sound like 20th century capitalists. There is one massive philosophical difference.
What's that?
Even though they were acting practically to build a capitalist economy, they still firmly, deeply believed they were just perfectly realizing eternal divine natural law principles.
Oh, wow. So they didn't think they were inventing new capitalist rules at all. They thought God and nature wanted America to be a booming commercial empire.
Yes, they believed that commercial progress was the divine endpoint. It was progress, yes, but it was progress with a predetermined spiritual limit, the perfect realization of divine principles on earth.
So they're still discovering, not creating.
Exactly. They didn't see themselves as creating new law out of thin air to manipulate society. They saw themselves as adapting eternal truths to the new context of an active commercial nation. The architecture was still entirely pre-modern.
Okay, so we have this beautiful, unified pre-modern vision in the first half of the 19th century. God, nature, the common law, and American commerce are all marching hand in hand toward perfection. It's a very confident era.
Extremely confident.
So how on earth does a nation lose its faith in universal natural law?
It goes to war with itself over the definition of that natural law.
Civil War.
The cataclysm of the Civil War. Think about the intellectual and spiritual crisis this caused. You have pro-slavery advocates in the South using natural law to justify the horrific institution of chattel slavery. They are claiming that God and nature ordained an inherent, inescapable social hierarchy based on race.
Right.
On the exact same day, you have anti-slavery advocates in the North using natural law to argue for unalienable, universal human rights and equality.
Both sides are pointing at the exact same sky, reading the exact same Bible, and claiming that God and nature are giving them completely opposite universal truths.
And they slaughter each other over it.
Mm.
The resulting violence, the death and maiming of a staggering percentage of the young male population, the burning of cities, it completely shattered the illusion of a shared divine moral order.
I mean, how could it not?
Exactly. You cannot maintain a belief in a unified cosmos when half the country is willing to kill the other half over the definition of justice. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the North's victory essentially ushered in an age of legal positivism.
Positivism meaning that the law is not some divine truth descending from the heavens. Law is simply the command of the sovereign. It is man-made, enforced by the barrel of a gun.
Right. The state won the war, therefore the state makes the law. And just like that, the pre-modern foundation evaporates. The X-ray machine is broken.
So if the law isn't grounded in God or nature anymore, what is it grounded in? Why should anyone obey it other than fear of punishment?
And that is where the modernist scramble for a new foundation begins.
We need a new bedrock.
Desperately. So the first stage of modernist law emerges in the late 19th century and is defined by a man named Christopher Columbus Langdell. He becomes the dean of Harvard Law School, and he completely revolutionizes legal education.
He's like the Descartes of American law.
That's a great way to put it. He brings in a Cartesian rationalist approach. He treated the law literally like Euclidean geometry.
Law as geometry. Okay, explain the mechanics of that. How do you turn a messy human dispute into a math equation?
Langdell believed that the thousands and thousands of chaotic, contradictory court cases were basically just raw data. He thought that if you studied them closely enough, you could use inductive reasoning to extract a few pure abstract axioms.
Like fundamental, unshakable rules of logic.
Yes. Once you extracted those axioms, you could put the messy cases away. From then on, you would use strict deductive logic to figure out the right rule for any future situation.
So you start with a big, abstract premise, and you logically deduce your way down to the specific ruling. He famously said the library was the laboratory of the legal scientist. But what happens if an actual judge decides a case in the real world in a way that doesn't fit Langdell's elegant mathematical equations? What if the reality of a town doesn't match the geometry?
Langdell would simply declare the actual court case wrong and useless.
You're kidding.
Nope, he would toss it out of the textbook entirely. If the concrete reality didn't match his abstract axiom, the reality was discarded.
That is wildly arrogant. He's just throwing out actual human decisions because they ruin his perfectly logical pyramid.
It was incredibly formalistic.
Yeah.
It was law completely divorced from human context. But this wasn't just an academic parlor game, It had massive, devastating, real-world consequences.
How so?
This exact logic gave birth to laissez-faire constitutionalism, which dominated the Supreme Court in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The most infamous example is Lochner v. New York in 1905.
Oh, this is the bakery case. Set the scene for us. What was happening in New York?
The conditions in New York bakeries at the turn of the century were brutal. They were often in poorly ventilated basements. Bakers were inhaling flour dust all day, developing lung diseases, and working 80 to 100 hours a week. It was literally killing people.
That's horrific.
So the progressive New York legislature passed a law limiting bakery workers to 60 hours a week max.
Which seems like a perfectly reasonable public policy to protect public health and prevent exploitation.
But the Supreme Court struck the law down as unconstitutional.
Wait, why?
Because using Langdellian-style deductive logic, they started with an abstract axiom. The individual has a fundamental right to freedom of contract. A baker and a bakery owner are two autonomous, free-choosing individuals.
Right.
Therefore, any state law interfering with their right to contract for 80 hours of labor a week logically violates the 14th Amendment.
So they totally ignored the empirical reality. They ignored the fact that a starving immigrant baker who needs to feed his family doesn't have equal bargaining power with a massive corporate bakery owner. The baker can't negotiate. He either works the 80 hours or he starves.
Exactly.
But the court just followed the abstract logic. Individual A wants to contract with individual B. The state cannot interfere.
They treated humans as abstract geometric points. They willfully ignored the sociology, the economics, and the human suffering, because those things couldn't be quantified in their logical axioms. Now, it's really important for you, the listener, to note here, whether we're talking about laissez-faire Lochnerism,
Right,
or pro-slavery natural law, or progressive policies, we are not taking political sides here. We are impartially mapping how these intellectual frameworks dictate real legal outcomes.
absolutely. That's a crucial point. We're just looking at the machinery. But I can easily see how that rigid, detached logic is going to trigger a massive backlash. I mean, you can only ignore reality for so long before reality fights back. And that brings us to the next stage.
It does. Stage 2 of modernist law American legal realism. It kicks into high gear in the 1920s and 30s, but the intellectual seed was planted earlier by Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. He wrote what is arguably the most famous sentence in American legal history.
What is it?
The life of the law has not been logic. It has been experience.
Goodbye, Descartes and pure reason. Hello, John Locke and the empiricists.
Exactly. The realists thinkers like Roscoe Pound, Jerome Frank, Felix Cohen, they didn't just disagree with Langdell's geometric system. They actively mocked it.
Really?
Oh yeah. Felix Cohen wrote a blistering critique calling those abstract axioms transcendental nonsense. He pointed out that courts were spending pages and pages using pure logic to determine where a corporation geographically resides for tax purposes.
Like physically.
Yeah, and Cohen argued that a corporation is just a piece of paper, doesn't reside anywhere. Asking where a corporation lives is as absurd as asking how many angels can dance on the head of a pin.
That's hilarious. So if Holmes is saying law is about experience, not logic,
Yeah.
and Cohen is tearing down the axioms, are the realists basically bringing the scientific method into the courtroom? What do they propose instead of geometry?
They turned entirely to empirical science and human reality. They argued that judges don't deduce answers from a magical math equation. Judges make the law.
They construct it themselves.
Yes, they are human beings, and they make decisions based on public policies, sociology, economics, and their own personal biases.
Jerome Frank famously pointed out that a judge's decision might be heavily influenced by what they ate for breakfast that morning.
If the judge has indigestion, you might get a harsher sentence. It sounds like a joke, but Frank was deadly serious. The realist stripped away the majestic illusion of objective logic and exposed the messy, human, policy-driven reality of the courts. But, and this is crucial, they were still modernists.
How so? If they destroyed the logical foundation, how are they still in the modernist camp?
Because they still desperately believed in an objective foundation. They just changed what the foundation was.
Okay, what was it?
They believed that if we just gathered enough empirical data, if we exhaustively studied the sociology of crime or the psychological impact of prison or the economics of the marketplace, we could scientifically engineer a better, more perfect society. They replaced the foundation of logic with the foundation of empirical science.
Okay, I have to push back here because this seems incredibly dangerous.
What do you mean?
Well, if you accept the realist premise that law isn't divine truth and it isn't objective logic, but just whatever human judges decide based on their gut, their breakfast, and their policy preferences. Wait, I mean, if law is just whatever they feel like, how is America any different from a dictatorship?
Yeah.
We are moving into the 1930s and 40s now. Totalitarian regimes are rising in Europe. Hitler and Stalin are using the law as a weapon of raw power. If law is just human preference, what separates the American Republic from Nazi Germany?
That exact terrifying anxiety is what birthed Stage 3, the legal process school. This school of thought completely dominated American law schools after World War II and into the Cold War.
So they saw this flop.
They saw it clearly. Scholars like Henry Hart, Herbert Whistler, and Lon Fuller looked at the realists and said, well, you guys went too far. You exposed the messy reality, but you left us with moral relativism. If law is just power, we have no intellectual defense against totalitarianism.
They need a new foundation, fast. But they can't go back to God and natural law, and they obviously can't rely on Langdell's cold logic because it caused the Lochner disaster. So where do they turn?
They take a transcendental turn toward procedure. They focus entirely on the structures of decision-making.
Procedure? You mean like bureaucratic red tape?
More like the fundamental democratic architecture of government. The legal process scholars argued this. Look, we live in a massive pluralistic society. We are never going to agree on substantive values. We will never agree on whether taxes should be high or low or whether unions are good or bad.
Sure, people will always fight about that.
But we can all agree on the democratic process.
So the foundation of the law isn't what is decided, it's how it's decided.
It's exactly the mechanism. As long as institutions follow reasoned, democratic procedures, the outcomes they produce are objective and valid. Legislatures are good at making broad policy because they represent the voters. They have hearings and debates. Courts are terrible at making policy, but they are great at resolving specific disputes. So the courts should use what they call reasoned elaboration.
Meaning the judge can't just rule based on indigestion anymore. They have to carefully, logically explain their decision based on existing precedent, tying it back to the procedures of the past.
As long as every branch of government stays in its proper lane and follows its specific procedures, the system is objective and fair. It doesn't matter if you hate the tax law. If it was passed through the proper procedural channels, it is objectively valid law.
So it neutralizes the politics.
Right. It was a brilliant, elegant way to defend American democracy against totalitarianism. It provided a neutral structural foundation.
It sounds perfect, almost too perfect. It sounds like a beautifully engineered machine. What threw a wrench in it?
The Civil Rights Movement, the 1950s and 60s, the Warren Court. This brings us to Stage 4 late crisis.
We're talking about the monumental cases of the 20th century, right? Brown v. Board of Education, desegregating the public schools. We're talking Griswold v. Connecticut, establishing a constitutional right to privacy for married couples to use contraception, and eventually Roe v. Wade.
Yes, and these cases achieved massive substantive justice. They righted historic, horrific wrongs that the legislative process had failed to fix for a century.
But
From the strict procedural view of the legal process scholars, these cases were an absolute disaster.
why? Because the Supreme Court was acting like a legislature, like they were stepping out of their lane.
Consider how Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the Brown v. Board opinion. From a legal process standpoint, a judge is supposed to use reasoned elaboration, relying strictly on precedent and constitutional text. But the precedent at the time was Plessy v. Ferguson, which explicitly allowed separate but equal segregation.
And the constitutional text of the 14th Amendment didn't explicitly mention schools.
Right. So Warren couldn't rely on strict procedure. Instead, he relied heavily on empirical sociological data, the famous Dole tests showing the deep psychological harm segregation caused to black children.
Which is incredibly important, but the legal process scholars must have lost their minds.
They were horrified. Now, to be clear, thinkers like Herbert Wessler personally agreed that segregation was evil,
Right.
but they argued the court had failed the test of neutral principles. By overturning precedent based on sociology, the court was making raw public policy. They were acting like a super legislature.
So the Warren Court basically forced modernism into a state of despair. Because the smartest legal scholars in the country are looking at these decisions and saying, well, these rulings are morally right, but procedurally wrong. It breaks their entire framework. If the procedure prevents justice, then procedure can't be the ultimate foundation of the law.
The procedural foundation cracked, and it opened the door for a radical movement in the 1970s called critical legal studies, or CLS. The crits looked at the legal process school and laughed. They claimed the idea of neutral procedures was a complete myth.
What did they argue instead?
They argued that the legal system is inherently designed to protect the wealthy and powerful, and procedure is just the mask they wear to make their power look objective.
The consensus of the 1950s just completely shatters. You have the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and the Kennedys, the disillusionment of the Vietnam War, the corruption of Watergate, the illusion of a unified, objective, procedural American legal system is dead. And we cross a shadowy border into postmodern jurisprudence.
Postmodernism in law abandons the search for an objective foundation altogether. There is no divine truth, no perfect Euclidean logic, no ultimate empirical data, and no neutral procedure. There is only interpretation, culture, and power.
This brings us to a scholar named Stanley Fish and the interpretive turn. Fish argued that there is no stabilized text, right? The Constitution doesn't have a single objective meaning sitting inside it, locked in a vault, waiting to be discovered by a smart enough judge. Meaning only exists within interpretive communities.
To see how that functions, think about the act of reading. When a judge reads the First Amendment today, they aren't reading it in a vacuum. They are reading it through the lens of their 3 years of law school education, their political background, the current cultural climate, and the linguistic norms of the 21st century.
So they bring all that baggage to the text.
The rules of interpretation are created by the community of lawyers and judges at that specific time.
So if you change the community, like if you change who gets to go to law school and who gets to sit on the bench, you literally change the meaning of the text.
The text itself doesn't change, but what the text does changes completely.
I want to bring in a fascinating analogy Feldman uses in the book regarding technology because it really highlights how physical tools change our intellectual frameworks. He points out how the shift from reading physical books to using computer-assisted research literally rewired legal thinking.
It is a profound observation about the architecture of knowledge. For decades, lawyers used something called the West Key number system. It was a massive, physical set of printed books that categorized every single legal case into rigid, predefined topics and subtopics.
And it perfectly mirrored modernist categorization. It was hierarchical and structured.
Very structured. You had to think the way the editors at West Publishing wanted you to think. If they didn't link a contract case to a tort case in their index, you would never find the connection.
But then came the 1980s and 90s, computers and Boolean searches, typing in your own combinations of words with and, or on databases like LexisNexis.
Exactly. Suddenly, researchers were freed from the rigid physical categories. They could run a search for a specific phrase and instantly connect disparate cases across completely different fields of law. The technology itself facilitated the postmodern breakdown of boundaries. It proved that the categories were artificial.
It's the ultimate democratization of data. You aren't reliant on the publisher's hierarchy anymore, which transitions perfectly into one of the most powerful movements in postmodern law outsider jurisprudence.
As law schools finally began to integrate in the late 20th century, an influx of feminist theorists and critical race theorists entered the academy, scholars like Patricia J. Williams, Richard Delgado, and Derek Bell. And they utilized postmodernism to devastating effect.
How did they dismantle the old frameworks?
They pointed out that the so-called objective truth of modernism, the neutral procedures and the rational person standards,
Right.
were actually just the subjective truths of the dominant cultural majority.
Namely, white, male, upper-class property owners.
Right. When the law claimed to be neutral, it was actually just normalizing the lived experiences of the powerful and completely erasing the experiences of everyone else.
So when a minority scholar applies postmodernism, they aren't just playing theoretical academic games. They are actively dismantling a system that oppressed them by exposing that the system's objectivity is a myth.
It validates the lived experience of the outsider. It uses storytelling and narrative to show how the law actually impacts marginalized communities, rather than just debating abstract axioms.
We are deep in the postmodern waters now, and Feldman identifies several overlapping themes of postmodern law. We've touched on anti-foundationalism, but I want to talk about how postmodernists view power, because it is radically different. They rely heavily on the French philosopher Michel Foucault.
Modernists thought power was something you hold, like a weapon or a king's scepter. The government has power, you don't. The boss has power, the worker doesn't. But Foucault argued that power is everywhere.
It's not just held by one person.
No, it's a web. It's in language, it's in daily habits, it's in the way a classroom is arranged, it's in the medical definitions of sanity and insanity. The law isn't just a hammer the state hits you with. It's a constant, shifting web of power relations you participate in every single day.
Which ties into their view of the self, too. Modernism believed in Descartes' autonomous, rational individual. I think, therefore I am. I am a single, unified self making logical choices.
Postmodernism shatters that. They introduce the fragmented intersectional self. You aren't a single unified essence. You are a collection of intersecting identities.
Yeah.
Your race, your gender, your economic class, your sexual orientation. And which part of your identity is dominant constantly shifts depending on the specific cultural context and power dynamics you are navigating at any given moment.
And because they believe all of this, because they know there is no absolute foundation, no neutral language, and no unified self, they write about the law using intense irony.
They have to. They can't make grand, earnest declarations like the modernists did, claiming to have found the ultimate equation for justice. So they use the tools of law and scholarship, ironically. They play the game, knowing it's a game, often winking at the audience while they deconstruct an opponent's argument. They expose the hidden contradictions in the law.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Not all postmodernists are just cheering each other on. There is some vicious infighting in the academy. You have Pierre Schlegel's critique of his fellow legal scholars, which is honestly hilarious and brutal.
It is a phenomenal critique. Schlegel points out the ultimate absurdity of modern legal scholarship. He notes that thousands of law professors write these incredibly dense, earnest, normative papers.
Telling people what to do.
Yes, they write 80-page articles telling Supreme Court justices what they should do in upcoming cases, acting as if they are free-choosing, autonomous selves talking to other free-choosing, autonomous selves.
And Schlegel's point is that the judges aren't reading them.
The judges do not care. The professors are shouting into the void. Schlegel argues that these scholars are trapped in a role, churning out papers for tenure, pretending they have power over the legal system, when in reality, they're just playing a highly scripted bureaucratic game.
That is brutal.
Schlegel says it's like watching a TV show where the characters think they are real. It exposes the utter lack of self-awareness in normative legal scholarship.
It's the academic equivalent of yelling at the referee through your television screen. You think you're participating in the game, but you're just making noise in your living room.
It is a devastating postmodern critique of the legal academy itself.
Man, this has been an incredible, exhausting 200-year voyage. From the cyclical feels of the founders trying to preserve a fragile republic, to the commercial zeal of the 1820s juicing the economy in the name of God. Then the shattered reality of the Civil War, the rise of Langdale's cold geometric logic starving the bakers in New York, the realists' empirical rebellion, the legal process scholars' desperate procedural defense against fascism, and finally, the postmodern plunge into interpretation, power webs, and irony.
It is a masterful synthesis by Feldman. Premodernism grounded law in divine natural law. Modernism shattered that, desperately seeking objective foundations through logic, experience, and procedure to control and endlessly progress society. Postmodernism stripped away all those foundations, exposing law as a cultural, interpretive practice filled with power dynamics and multiple truths.
So where is this all going? I mean, what is the future of American law if the foundations are gone? Feldman uses this amazing analogy in his final chapter regarding Wonder Bread, and I think it perfectly encapsulates the tension we live in today.
He compares modernist legal scholarship, the standard, rule-based, objective-seeking procedural law, to Budweiser and Wonder Bread. It's generic, it's mass-produced, it's a staple, everyone knows what it is, and it gets the basic job done. Postmodernism, with its complex, interdisciplinary, deconstructive theory about power and intersectionality, is the handcrafted boutique bread.
So Langdell's rigid geometry was the original Wonder Bread factory. Mass-produced, identical rulings for everyone.
Exactly. And the question Feldman poses is, will scholars keep manufacturing Wonder Bread, but just add a layer of postmodern irony to it? Or will the average everyday lawyer ensure that basic pragmatic modernist law survives forever? Because let's face it, if you get rear-ended at a stoplight, you don't want your lawyers submitting a brief deconstructing the intersectional power dynamics of the municipal traffic system.
Definitely not.
You want the Wonder Bread rules of negligence so you can get your car fixed and your medical bills paid.
The practical demands of society require some level of stability, even if it is philosophically ungrounded. We need the illusion of the X-ray machine just to get through the day. But Feldman also warns of something darker, doesn't he? He calls it postmodern terrorism.
He points to the Rehnquist Supreme Court of the late 20th century as an example. He suggests that sometimes the court acts not because they have an objective foundation and not because they are following neutral procedures, but simply because the structure of society demands that they assert power and make a ruling to end a dispute.
So they just force a conclusion.
They impose an arbitrary meaning just to stop the endless postmodern spin. It's a raw exercise of power, masking itself as traditional foundational law. They shut down the debate by force.
Which brings us right back to where we started. The diagnostic muddy waters. The broken X-ray machine. We are arguing over the X-ray, but the machine itself is constantly being rebuilt by history.
We are swimming in waters we rarely stop to analyze.
So, here's a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. The next time you find yourself in a heated argument, the next time you confidently pound the table and state that a law or a Supreme Court decision is simply right or wrong, ask yourself which ghost of history is speaking through you. Are you relying on a pre-modern belief that there is a universal divine truth that the judge simply failed to discover? Are you leaning on a modernist faith in logic, empirical science, and strict procedure, demanding that the system act like a perfect machine? Or are you ready to embrace the postmodern reality that your definition of justice is just one voice in a boundless, shifting cultural choir driven by power and interpretation? Think about it, because the firm, unshakable foundation you think you're standing on, well, it might already be crumbling.